Hello, everybody, and welcome to this bonus lecture in Geography 178, Conservation of the Environment. Today we're going to be talking about restoring natural systems. How do you plan, monitor, and assess restoration of dynamic landscapes? I apologize, I'm pretty congested today, feeling a little bit under the weather at the time of recording, so if I sound a bit nasally, that's why. So first off, with the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, wouldn't be possible if not for tons of different collaborations and uh, communication between all of these different entities you see here. So research and science is not something that is done by one person ever. It takes a lot of teamwork and a lot of collaboration to do the things that we like to do and to learn and experience the landscapes that we're trying to improve. So you've seen this quote before. It's how I started 178. The world has changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Much that once was is lost, for none now live who remember it. And I felt it was a really poignant way to start this talk out because we're talking about restoration and how do you restore, and through that, if we think of our definitions of conservation, conserve a landscape that has been degraded by years of us people. So we're facing widespread environmental challenges, and we've talked about this before, and we've talked about this a bit in our class. So the two areas that we're going to focus on in this talk are going to be the coastal zone and streams and rivers, or the riparian zone. So coastal zone, we're seeing rising sea levels across the globe, eroding shorelines, populations that are severely at risk, and infrastructure that is also at risk. If we think of Hurricane Ian that just ripped through Florida, very recently prior to the recording of this video, there's a lot of damage and a lot of people. These are natural disasters that we have to examine. And based on where the majority of our population lives, the coastal zone is one of the most impacted areas across our world. And then ecosystems are at risk as well. We've talked about this biophysical system, right? So then on the streams and rivers side, we've got that LULC means land use and land cover change. So from native prairie or native forest to row crop agriculture, as we talked about previously. We see increases in peak and total discharge. That's the amount of water going through a stream at the peak. So as a storm was to come through, the river rises or the stream rises, and that peak is increasing. We're seeing what we call a flashier system, and we're seeing increases in total discharge. That means that more is just running off and not really soaking down into the earth. There's widespread pollution impairment as well because of the nutrients and chemicals we use on things like crops, our yards, etc. And that leads to a few things called eutrophication and hypoxia. And you might have heard of the dead zone in the Gulf of California. Well, that's a hypoxic zone, a zone of very low oxygen that is often influenced by eutrophication, which is basically zones of high nutrients and high production. So you think of algae blooms, those are driven in eutrophic systems. So the overarching themes that we're going to talk about in the lecture here today are going to be what is restoration? How do we restore dynamic systems? And I'll talk a little bit about what that word means. And then how do you determine if you've been effective or not? How is efficacy determined when you're trying to restore natural systems? So the first off, we're going to start off with what is restoration? Is it converting an urbanized space to a natural space? Is it replanting vegetation? Rebuilding a landform maybe that was there and isn't anymore? Maintaining a status quo, meaning you're just making sure nothing further changes on the landscape. You're basically stopping change from continuing. Or maybe it's returning it to some type of pre-disturbance state. That means that something happened to it. It was disturbed in some way, shape, or form. And our goal as a restorationist is to return it to a pre-disturbance state. Now, if you look at any one of those only, I would call that kind of you're the ship heading for the tip of the iceberg. You're not seeing the whole thing, right? But if you consider all of these different aspects together, you're getting a better picture and you're getting a better idea of how you should or could restore a degraded landscape. So dynamic systems are ones that we refer to as eco-geomorphic, and that's a big word. So eco, ecology, ecosystem, geo, earth, morph or morphic, change. So basically we're looking at eco-geomorphic systems. So landforms that are intimately connected with ecology and how they are in a constant state of change through sediment transport, so how wind and water moves throughout a system on Earth, seasonal vegetation dynamics, so coastal dune vegetation or riparian or river along a river riparian, that's what that means, vegetation, or what we call supply and or transport limiting factors. Can you move the sediment? Can you uh, stop or prevent that sediment from moving? What's the state of how things are moving across your landscape? And dynamic systems are more or less equivalent to resilient systems. We'll talk a bit about why. So first off, what is a resilient landform? So originally this talk was designed for talking about coastal foredunes, which is a landform and feature that I study, and I've studied a lot, but I've kind of converted it to be more about just landforms in general. So a resilient landform is one that can maintain and recover its ecosystem form and function in response to disturbance events. So morphodynamics, basically how dynamic change is occurring on those landforms, sediment budgets, plant communities. But it's also something that can adapt to longer term changes. If you were a coastal dune, you would want to see that if your sea level was changing, that form, that dune is also changing in correspondence to that sea level change. But that requires accommodation space. So basically what accommodation space is, that means that it requires space for that landform to be able to move into. And it also requires that plant community to change and succeed as well. So if we want to see something that's resilient and adaptive, we have to have something that has the right ecosystem and the ability to move and migrate. Now, that's not often the case. You can see in these two images here, this is what a lot of our shorelines look like. They butt right up against the coast. The beach is right there. You can see the waves. This is a serious challenge to have resilient systems in developed areas. So nature-based solutions are one of the ways that we look to improve our ecosystems and landforms. So this uses natural materials and or different processes to create or restore landforms and their ecosystem services. These approaches are pretty widely varied, and they're not all functional, they're not all resilient, and they're not all sustainable. And we've talked a lot about those words in class as well, especially that sustainable one. One of the ways to think about this is a living shoreline, so one that's just vegetation everywhere, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a dynamic or resilient shoreline. So we ask how to evaluate their effectiveness versus artificial engineering solutions. So putting features along a beach to prevent erosion or stop sediment from moving. Dynamic landform restoration is what we do to restore or reestablish ecosystem form and function using nature-based solutions. So we talked about nature-based solutions. Dynamic landform restoration uses those ideas to try and reestablish the form and function of the ecosystem and the landform. So we want to enhance transport processes and morphodynamics. We want to improve landform resilience. We want to either remove bad, I say bad as a moral agent, invasive vegetation that shouldn't be there, but it has been brought over by us, and maybe replant or allow native vegetation to regrow. And dynamic and resilient systems typically equal improved ecosystem services. So we see habitat for threatened and endemic species increasing. We see flood protection potential and erosion control measures, sand drift control if you're in a coastal system, or dust emissions mitigation if you're in a coastal system, meaning that dust is not able to be emitted or ejected from the landscape. And dust can have a lot of bad effects if you breathe it in a lot. And these can serve as climate change adaptation strategies. We can use these to improve our expected landscapes and trends considering climate change. So there's a spectrum of these different restoration approaches. We've got reactivation, so we are decreasing invasive vegetation to increase native species and biodiversity, increase transport and activity, increase morphodynamics and geomorphic diversity, so different types of processes and landforms, improve ecological and disturbance processes, and then improve resilience. We also have reestablishment, so increasing native plant cover and biodiversity, increasing transport processes and deposition, increasing development and morphodynamics, increasing ecology and disturbance processes, increasing ecosystem services to increase resilience. So we're going to look at 4 different case studies here. So we're looking at the Landfair Dunes in Arcata, California, which is a case for reactivation. The Eel River Estuary Preserve in Ferndale, California, which is really just a rebuilding. The dune was rebuilt. The Oceano Dunes in the Pismo Beach area, which is a case of reestablishment. And then County Ditch 57, which is an agricultural watershed in Mapleton, Minnesota, so a little bit south of Mankato, if you're familiar with the area. And there was kind of a mix. So we'll talk about all these here in the next number of slides. So how do we do this and how are we going to do it? Well, the first question we need to ask ourselves is how do you monitor change on functional time and space scales? We're geographers, right? We want to know if we're looking at this landform, are we accounting for the time it takes for that landform or landscape to change, or the vegetation to change and grow and develop? And are we looking at a wide enough area to see, okay, sand is moving, for example, up onto the beach, and then it gets deposited into the dunes, and then maybe it moves landward. So you have to consider, as a scientist and as a geographer, all of these different interconnected webs. And we've talked about the interconnected nature in these biophysical systems, right? And we just got done talking about these really intricate examples of these biophysical systems when we were talking about the Teddy Roosevelt National Park area and the Western North Dakota Badlands. So we use a lot of really fun tools to do this. High resolution remote sensing. So high resolution means high spatial resolution. So we can have pixels, basically, if you think of a computer or a camera, a pixel that is 1.2 centimeters, and we can have millions of those to make up one image, covering an entire landscape. We can also use things like something called LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. What that is basically a little robot that spins around in 360 degrees or is flown from a plane, and that robot emits its own pulse of light. And the time it takes for that light energy to bounce off of something and come back, and the angle at which it does that, lets us know not only where it was, but how high it was relative to the laser. So we can reconstruct these landscapes almost perfectly using these methods. Now we also use things like time-lapse cameras and satellite imagery, like we talked about towards the beginning of class. If we think back to Landsat and some of those satellites that we talked about. And then we need to think that long-term programs and commitments are needed. These projects can take years to decades. They take collaborative partnerships with researchers, managers, engineers, stakeholders, all these different people to inform on what we call adaptive management. And then you have to coordinate these things. You have to figure out, well, how are we going to do this so that if I change my watershed or my beach and dune, that my neighbors are going to do something similar? Because if not, then it's kind of like a Band-Aid on a really big wound. It doesn't really solve the problem. So here's the first area we're going to talk about, the Landfair Dunes in Northern California. So these you can see here, this is a picture from a drone that I was flying, and I took this picture. This is a dynamically restored foredune. So here we removed the invasive species and replanted native species. And the idea here is that we're kind of allowing these ecogeomorphic processes to return to the system. So here you can see what the restoration site looked like. So you see that really thick, dense grass right above my head here? Well, that's something called Ammophila arenaria. That's an invasive grass that grows along the beach and on the dune. And it's really good at taking over and basically just outcompeting every native species that should be here. Now the stuff to the north, so north in this example is, sorry, that way in the picture. So stage right, or stage left, I mean. So you see the Elmis mollis, dune mat, and dune mat Elmis mollis, DMEM. So these are all different configurations of native species that were replanted after that invasive was removed. And we've been out there for the last 6 years, 7 years now, actually monitoring exactly how this dune has been changing over about 7 years. So here we can see an example of the first, or one of the first aerial flights that we did here in April of 2016, and then again in October of 2020, as this system has been changing. And on the right, we see on-ground images from April of 2016, May of 2017, and July of 2022. So in April of 2016, the invasive plant removal was pretty much done. We saw a lot of sediment moving landward, and then we got hit with what we call an El Nino. So an ENSO event, or an El Nino Southern Oscillation event, is kind of set up by warmer ocean currents coming up along the Pacific coast, kind of changing how storms and kind of trajectories occur when waves are coming up onto the beach. And that caused a lot of erosion that year. The next year, native replanting in May 2017 had been completed. And then we got hit with some really, really heavy storms in the winter of 2016 to 2017. So we saw the foredune was no longer what we call coupled to the beach. So when we say it's coupled, that means that sand is moving from one onto the other. But when it's decoupled, there's a break. Here it was about a 2 to 3 meter, so taller than me, cliff that was preventing sand from moving onto the beach and nourishing the beach. And that's really important because a lot of the species that live here thrive on being buried. That's an adaptation to that these plants have developed. They need to be buried so that they can stimulate a growth response. And then in July of 2022, 6 growing years later, we see the foredune in the native area had recoupled. It took a lot longer in the invasive area to recouple. We see native vegetation had succeeded and expanded all over the place. And really, this was a great indicator that this project had been successful. And here we can see a really cool GIF that I created, or a series of GIFs that I created, of how what we call the profile of the dune changed over time. So here, the ocean is this way. So the dune is, you can see the dune form there, the kind of peaked form in the middle. And then landward is this way. So we can see how much that's changed over time and how in the first two, the transect 18 and transect 17, it just expanded and grew and became a much bigger dune, where in the transect 16, which was just Ammophila, it didn't. It actually stayed relatively steep, and it wasn't able to really maintain an active form like we wanted to see. So here, this is another fun tool that we as geographers use, one that I've used a lot. So here, volumetric changes are being signified in red. So red is erosion. That means land or area or surface has been removed. And then blue means deposition. So that means that there's been an increase in volume at a particular location. So from November 2015 to April of 2016, we see the El Nino Southern Oscillation event had happened. There's a lot of erosion and a lot of red along the beach, and then we can see that pretty apparent. From April 2016 through May of 2017, the removal and replanting of vegetation continued, and we got hit with another really big storm, the biggest that we'd seen, the most lowering of our beach here. So really, for 2 consecutive seasons, it had been hit really hard with storms. And then in May of 2017 through May of 2018, the beach was what we call accreting. So it was increasing kind of ubiquitously across the beach. And the foredune was starting to rebuild. And in through May of 2018 through September of 2019, the foredune, this form that we're looking at, had recoupled with the beach in the natively revegetated areas, and it took a bit longer in the invasively revegetated areas. But we saw the foredune become active again. And then in September of 2019 to through May of 2021, we see landward sand transfer resuming. And really that continued through September of 2021, when the last of the projects we have on this map here. And we can see here from November of 2021 to September of 2021, all of the change. This is the entire record. So the oldest compared to the newest. And we can see that the beach has had a lot of change, but the foredune has grown significantly. And that's what we really, really want to see when we're trying to restore a system, is want to see that dune or that form is actively maintaining itself. So in the invasive control plot, the Ammophila plot, it remains steep and densely vegetated, persistently scarped and decoupled. It saw lower onshore sand transfer. Saw slower recovery times and limited geomorphic response. So this is an indicator of diminished resilience. And then the restored plot saw gentler seaward slopes, lower plant densities, increased sand transfer and storage volumes, similar to a native control plot that is just off view on these maps here. So that led to faster recovery and recoupling to the beach and enhanced resiliency. These are all things that we really want to see when we're trying to look at how a system can adapt to anthropogenic climate change and rising sea levels. So we're done with Landfair for now. We're going to jump over a little south along the exact same shoreline to the Eel River Estuary Preserve. So here's the Eel River Estuary Preserve here. A lot different of a system. It's what we call a monoculture, so it's really just a single plant type of that Ammophila arenaria, that invasive species we talked about. It's backed by a broad coastal plain and estuary system. These are coastal features here. So it's very flat for a decent extent inward or inland from here. And then this land is used primarily for grazing and agriculture. Not on the dunes, but further landward. So here we can see the little slice of dune that we're looking at. So in 2002, you can see in the circle there, this particular section of dune was almost wiped out. We see that little stream on the back side of it, on the landward side, kind of eating into it from the landward side, and we see the waves are bashing into it from the seaward side. So sometime around July of 2004, it overwashed, and that dune was washed away, no longer there. You can see dunes on either side of it, but that particular portion, was washed away. It was gone. In 2009, you can see it there, and in the bottom right, that's 2019. You can now see that dune is been rebuilt, and I'll show you what that looks like here in the next slide. So here you go. So this is May of 2018. This is immediately before it was rebuilt. And then October of 2020, this is a couple of seasons after it was rebuilt. It was rebuilt in the late summer of 2018. So I think July, August, it was reconstructed. And what they did was they took sand from that kind of fan-shaped feature on the back by where that river is, and they pushed it up, and they basically just reshaped the dune. So they didn't really do anything else. They just reshaped it. They didn't plant vegetation. They didn't do anything about the invasives that were around it on either side. They were basically just trying to create a continuous dune feature along this coast. So here we can see those maps again. Remember, red equals erosion, blue equals deposition. So here we can see the erosional, that really big erosional portion on A. That's where they removed the sediment from the overwash fan and they pushed it back up onto the dune, which is really, really vibrant blue, to reconstruct the feature. And from October to December, nothing much really happened. If we look just below A, unfortunately, this is a different orientation. So it goes AB on the left, CD on the right. So we can see a little bit of erosion along the beach, a little bit of deposition along the beach, but that was about it. The same thing in October of 2018 through September of 2019. There really wasn't any change going on over this time. Let's step forward a little bit. So here we are in September of 2019 through October of 2020. Look at that, we see some deposition along the beach. And then the erosion started in October of 2020 through May of 2021, and May 2021 through September of 2021. We saw significant erosion along this section of beach. And there you can see it from October of 2018 to September of 21 at the bottom. The beach has been severely eroded, the dune has been severely eroded, and let's see what that looks like from the ground. So here it is in May of 2019, about a year and a half after it was rebuilt. And here it is in July of 2022. So you didn't see this in those maps. I was just out there in July, and it has been almost entirely destroyed. In fact, basically everything you can see from the edge of the vegetation and kind of the top or the middle portion of the image here, all the way to the horizon was basically what we call overwashed and eroded away. Why? Well, only the form was rebuilt. There was nothing else going on here. No revegetation strategy was employed. They didn't account for the system trends. So this is a really erosive part of the coast, and they wanted to basically just create and maintain a levee. They just wanted something to prevent erosion further inland. So they didn't really consider what the geomorphic and ecosystem trends are supposed to be. So after about 3 years, this project was basically a failure. Now we're going to move a little bit further south to the Pismo Dune, or Pismo Beach area, the Oceano Dunes. This is another place that I worked during my doctoral studies. Here you can see what the established developed dunes look like. It's a beautiful place to be. Unfortunately, this is not the only thing that it looks like. If you go a little bit north of where we are in this photo and turn around, it looks like this. Really big, bare, broad sand sheets. And you can actually see this picture was taken by a colleague during the restoration project. So we can see here the broad flat sand plain, and why, you might ask? Well, it's been completely obliterated by decades and decades of OHV, or you could call, or that stands for off-highway vehicle, but you could also say quad, four-wheeler, ATV, all-terrain vehicle. They all kind of mean the same thing. So it's been, and camping. So it's been just obliterated by years and years and years of us using this system. So the dunes that we saw in that last image should have been basically throughout this whole stretch of coast. And the reason, the kind of what we'd call the impetus for this study, is that this area has been in violation for federal and state air quality standards regarding dust emissions from these dunes. So the San Luis Obispo County Air Pollution Control District issued a stipulated order of abatement. That's basically a court order saying you have to reduce dust emissions by 50% by 2023. So dune restoration was used as a dust emission control measure. It included a 20-hectare foredune, which had 5 different treatments installed in February of 2020 from a combination of surface texturing, so what we call a sheep's foot roller. It's basically, looks like a rolling pin that's got these basically prongs sticking out of it. The point is to dimple the surface. You push it, with a bobcat or a tractor of some type. Then we had native seeds, seedlings, a sterile hybrid grass, and straw cover. All of these things were used to try and restore the system. And we used those nearby dunes that we saw a couple slides ago as a reference site to say, okay, well, if they get something like this, then we're doing it right. And we started with what we call biannual, twice a year, drone campaigns from October of 2019 through the present. And we can see that weird orange looking plane in the bottom right. That's what I lovingly call my big orange surfboard. That's a drone that I use throughout my PhD studies. And the hypothesis here, we're scientists, is that the most intensive treatments will result in enhanced dune growth and plant community development with enhanced dust emissivity control. Let's find out if that actually was the case. So here we see in February of 2020, this is the treatment installation. So 1 is a control, so that's where only the sheep's foot was rolled across it. 2, seed was distributed, native seed mix was distributed. In 3, the seed and a sterile grass hybrid seed was distributed. In 4 and 5, those are different planting densities. So we have low density nodes and high density nodes. Basically what it is, it's a straw circle. And at the middle of that straw circle, you can see the circles in 4 really well. At the middle of that straw circle is 9 different native plants. So the straw is there to protect them while they kind of initiate their growth cycles. In 5, it's just a much denser array of those exact same straw circles, some of them overlapping, basically as a way to increase the density of those planting, or basically the plants that could grow. And then in 6, it's just broadcast straw, so a complete cover of straw, seeds, and native seedlings. So these are the 6 things that we did. So in February of 2022, a couple years later, it looks really different already. So we see some texturing, we see some dunes that are starting to pop up. In 3, we see a lot of things going on. So let's see what that looks like from the ground. So here, this is treatment response as of May of 2022. So we can see site 1 on our top left, that's just our control site, nothing really happening. Site 2, we can see some what we call Nebka dunes developing. That's what we see here. That's basically the Nebka is the dune that forms within the vegetation. So the vegetation grows, it traps the sand, it buries the vegetation, and then the vegetation is signaled to grow again. That's that adaptation that we talked about. And then behind it is what we call a shadow dune or an echo dune. It's basically a dune that forms behind this feature because this feature is protruding off the surface and messing up the wind patterns. So sand is deposited behind it. It's a pressure thing. We can talk about that if you ever want to talk about aeolian geomorphology. That's one of the things I study with me. Site 3, we can see a lot of different things going on there. That's the seed and sterile grass. That is about a 3-foot human for scale. On the bottom here, we can see site 4, low density planting nodes. We actually had an issue here where we would have what's called erosional streets developing between the straw circles because wind was being funneled between these straw circles and sediment was just kind of being moved through it. It's not something we expected or could have foreseen happening. In 5, we see a lot of dunes developing, but they're kind of developing in isolated pockets. And then in 6, we see a lot of little dunes, but not really any big dunes. Because here we basically shut the system down. So sediment hasn't really moved through the system in the same way that we see in 2 or 3 or even 5. So here we can see another one of those volume change maps. So February 2021 to October 2021, this is the second wind and growth season. And then October 2021 to February of 2022, this is the second year after restoration had finished. So all treatments had positive sediment budgets and early stage dune development and a pretty high survivorship of all of the plants that we had planted there. The top performer was the second least intensive treatment. So our third treatment plot, T3, which was just native seed and sterile grass, it was the second least intensive, but it was the absolute best performer. So we'll get back to that in a few slides. And we'll actually come back to Oceano in just a few slides, but let's take one more quick diversion a little bit closer to home. to County Ditch 57. This is where I actually did my master's work and my first experience in grad school. So here, it's about a 25 hectare watershed, about 6.6 kilometer open channel. It was originally constructed in 1903, and it was reconstructed in 2020 or 2010 to 2011 to include peak flow, nutrient, and sediment reduction strategies. So we call this a multi-purpose drainage management project. We did not call it a restoration project because there was it was not my project to run. I thought this was a restoration project, and the things that they did are incredibly ingrained in restoration ideology, but engineers didn't want to really call it a restoration project, and that's okay. So here's one of the things they put there. It was a weir. These are designed to reduce or restrict flow through the stream, increase residency time, so the amount of time that water is staying in the system, decrease sediment, and decrease nutrients. So if you slow water, the particulate matter in water can begin to settle out if the water doesn't have enough energy to maintain those particulates within the flow. We also had something called a two-stage ditch. These are designed to reduce peak discharge, reduce sediments and nutrients, and reduce bank erosion. The idea here is that typically with a conventional ditch, you see in the middle on that little graphic on the bottom that I made, it's just a kind of a V-shaped ditch. Now, a two-stage ditch is supposed to be broader at the base with a smaller inset channel so that the channel can actually meander and migrate within that first little bench. It basically has its own floodplain, which is what a stream and a river want to have, so that once it storms, water can rise above the channel and deposit onto the banks. And when it deposits onto the banks, that velocity is slowing down and you're settling out the sediments and the nutrients. And then the plants that are along the bank, riparian vegetation, are able to take up and utilize those nutrients. And then there was what we call a surge pond and a wetland. The idea here is that you're reducing velocity and peak discharge. There's a reduction in sediment and nutrient loads for the exact same reasons we've been talking about, and possibly increased infiltration, so more water is seeping into the subsurface. There's an increase in potential habitat for migratory bird species, and actually provided storage to the upper half of the watershed. So here, this was slightly different. We didn't use drones and laser scanners and things here. This was a much more applied project in the sense that we had 4 what we call auto samplers. So these are things that have a tube that runs into the water, and depending on how I program it, if it rains and the level of the water rises so far, maybe 10% of its current value, then those auto samplers will trigger. And every hour, they will take a bottle, a full bottle, a liter of water for 24 consecutive bottles. So basically I have 24 hours of water quality from the time it starts to storm and the stage starts to rise through the end of that 24-hour period. We had 8 different sites that were looking at the area of this channel and the velocity of the water moving through it. So then you get that discharge thing we talked about earlier, the volume of water, the rate of water moving through the channel. We had 7 different rain gauges to understand differential rainfall across the watershed. We had 4 what we call physiochemical probes. So these are things to look at chemical properties of the water. We had a meteorological station or a weather station. And then these were continuously running from March through November. So what did we find? Well, the surge pond accomplished its goal of reducing peak flow. That was awesome. That's what we wanted to see. And it was variable, but the best at sediment and nutrient reduction capability. The 2-stage ditch was less effective with peak flow reduction and had variable nutrient and sediment load reduction. The rate control weir, that weir that I showed you with the water rushing through it, struggled with erosion and peak flow reduction, and it exhibited little to no nutrient and sediment reduction. And we saw that some events did store nutrients and sediment. That's what we wanted to see. And then we saw that once you had a big storm roll through, the entire system just flushed out, and all that stored sediment and nutrients was just washed into the next river down. So the pieces were there. What went wrong? So here's that rate control weir. You can see downstream of it, we're basically increasing the velocity of water coming through this little portion of the channel. And when we do so, we are sending it jetting forward. And if you see on the left-hand side there, that's undercutting of the bank. That's happening because we're basically destabilizing our bank because we're increasing the water velocity and eroding the stream banks. And we saw a lot of erosion within kind of what we call the plunge zone also, just underneath where that water is coming through. And then at one point, the weir was eroded around. If you see the rocks on the far side of that right image, those were put there because the water had just eaten its way around this weir, making it completely ineffective. The two-stage ditch, well, here we can see the two-stage ditch. You can kind of see the benches there. Well, the Minnesota DNR actually went out and surveyed this. And this is what it looked like. Had a wide channel that was lacking any type of bankful bench, which it's supposed to have if it's got a two-stage ditch. And it really just wasn't constructed the right way. Now, this is in comparison to what a two-stage ditch should look like. We see here. You see how broad that bench is, how wide that bench is? It was just a case of poor engineering and poor execution. And then the surge basin and wetland had a slew of issues. Remember that eutrophication word? Well, you can see an algae bloom in the top left picture. You can see bank sloughing. So basically the banks were eroding and slumping down in that top right one. We completely bypassed. There was another weir here that you can see in that top right image that was there to divert water into the surge pond, and that was just washed over if the stage rose enough. And at one point we were completely over capacity. You can see on that bottom right image. So the problems here are that the project did not account for current and future climates. The structural practices had the right idea, but the wrong implementation. So the bigger problem here is that we're seeing an increase in historic precipitation in Minnesota and Wisconsin, this entire Midwest region. So these storms are increasing in intensity, and they're increasing the amount they're dumping on us at any given time. What comes along with that is the potential for increased erosion. So these were constructed for maybe what we would have thought, 20 years ago the system was like, but they're not constructed for the system that we are confirming is there today. So they were all underbuilt. They were all underserving what they were supposed to do. So here we can see kind of what we call a performance assessment framework. So the idea here is that you are using measurable indicators to track the system properties and responses over time. So geomorphology and ecology, biotic community attributes, logistical or pragmatic considerations. So you can see in the first two boxes here, identify and implement. So you need to identify your spatial and temporal scale of your project, your treatment strategies, your indicators of landform, form and function, what monitoring protocols and reporting protocol you're going to use. Then you get to the monitoring and quantifying part. You need to measure those indicators. You need to track their performance over whatever you decide as a reporting interval, and you need to quantify responses and changes that you're trying to measure. Then you get down to the cumulative assessment, so you have to come up basically with these indicator rankings. So you need to identify issues or limitations with what you're doing, basically. And then with positive performance indicators across resiliency, this should, we think, equal more resilient systems. You can come up with adaptive management strategies where you develop a framework to evaluate performance assessment, advancements and limitations, modify treatments as necessary, which go back to feed your scope of what you're identifying and implementing and the methods you're using to monitor and quantify it. And here's an example of what one of those looks like. We're not really going to dive into this. You can pause the video here if you want, But basically what we're saying is all of these in some way promote resilience or are attributes of a resilient dune, or increase the ability of the dune to respond quickly and more completely to disturbance and change. That's what this project, this is Oceano, set out to do. So this is what we developed for Oceano. And here's what we came up with. So these are just the values that we came up with. There were 6 different plots, so they're ranked 1 through 6, where think of it like golf. You want the low score. So we had total scores and final relative rankings that you can see here. So we can see T3, our native seed and sterile grass, was the best performer, followed by T5, the high density planting nodes, was our next best performer. So these can be assessed annually to inform on adaptive management and learn how to alter and adapt the system to what you're seeing in real time. And then this method could be used to modify intersite comparisons, standardized protocol, indicators and methods, basically a way to actively change what you're trying to do based off of the data that you're getting. So I like this picture. I used it in my dissertation defense, the elephant in the dunes. So restoration is a key adaptation strategy for building resilience to climate. There's a wide range of nature-based approaches, but not all of them work. Not all of them are functional or resilient. They might just alter the system at a given time, but that doesn't mean that they're effective. Dynamic restoration can improve ecosystem form, function, services, and resilience in geomorphic form, and is really a good approach to restoring a system. So the best practices for monitoring, assessing performance, and adaptive management are generally lacking. There's not a lot of communication on this, unfortunately, because we all have different ideas on how it should be done. They're often overlooked or ad hoc, meaning they're just kind of happening whenever. They're limited in scope, coordination, budgets, and there's a low interest or buy-in, factor there. A lot of times they are experimental in what we're doing. We're trying to see, will this work? So research and monitoring are incredibly important and crucial to determine the success. The pressing needs here, we need to coordinate on how to indicate success, and we need to coordinate on how to refine our performance assessment frameworks. We need to collaborate on between interdisciplinary teams of scientists and researchers, coastal managers, planners, engineers, other stakeholders, watershed, people within the watershed. Basically, whoever's in there, your stakeholders, need to have a seat at the table when you're trying to restore a system. And then you need commitments. So beyond just implementation for longer term monitoring and adaptive management, because the scientist who's there is only there as long as their contract is, because we have to make money and we have to do research that's impactful. So there has to be a plan in place for longer term monitoring. So that is the bonus lecture presentation here. So if you have any questions, go ahead and shoot me an email. If you want to talk about it, go ahead and shoot me an email. Wanted to thank Dr. Ian Walker and Colin Marvin, 2 colleagues of mine. Colin Marvin was an undergraduate that I worked with a lot. He's now a graduate student at Stanford. Dr. Ian Walker is at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So hope you all enjoyed that bonus lecture, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you.